You know, there are certain names that, when spoken, instantly bring back an entire memory of history. Say Normandy, and people think of D-Day, the sacrifice of thousands who stormed the beaches to open the road to freedom. Say Stalingrad, and the mind recalls a clash so brutal the whole world held its breath. Say Auschwitz, and the word itself has become the very symbol of genocide. But there's another name, smaller, quieter, one you may never have heard before: Palmyra. Palmyra was just a patch of forest outside Warsaw, Poland's capital. Yet in the darkest years of World War II, that forest became a cemetery for some of the nation's brightest souls. More than 1,700 people, intellectuals, politicians, priests, journalists, artists, even Olympic champions, were brought there, not to fight, but to die. Historians often call Palmyra the Katyn of Poland. You may recall Katyn, the massacre where tens of thousands of Polish officers were executed by the Soviets and buried in the forest. Palmyra carried the same symbolic weight: the annihilation of a nation's brain, the killing of its spirit by erasing the very people who could have led it. And maybe you're asking yourself, why them? Why didn't the Nazis focus only on soldiers? Why target writers, professors, journalists, even athletes? The bitter answer is this: war doesn't only happen on the battlefield. It also happens in the heart and the will of a people. If you want to erase a nation, you don't just bomb their cities, you paralyze their mind. You silence their voices. You destroy those who inspire and hold a society together.
I want you to picture this.
Imagine living in New York or Washington. One day, the familiar faces are gone. The professor who once inspired you, the journalist whose words you trusted, the artist whose plays made you think, the athlete you cheered for. All of them vanished. And months later, you hear the truth. They were driven into the woods at night, lined up, and buried in mass graves. How would your community carry on? What would that silence feel like? I once spoke with an American veteran who helped liberate Europe. He told me, war doesn't just kill people, it kills dreams. Palmyra is proof of that. Among the dead was Janusz Kusowczynski, Poland's 1932 Olympic champion. To Poles, he wasn't just an athlete, he was a symbol of pride and possibility. When he fell in that forest, it wasn't just the death of a man, it was a calculated blow meant to crush the soul of a nation. And what makes Palmyra even more haunting is the silence that surrounded it. The crimes happened in secret. Trucks driving people into the woods at night, shots muffled by trees, then the city waking up the next morning as if nothing had happened. Isn't that terrifying? Death unfolding in plain sight while society was forced to remain silent. Have you ever felt that? That gnawing sense of injustice, knowing something is wrong, but being powerless to speak. As a historian, when I study Palmyra, I don't see it only as a Polish tragedy. I see it as a mirror. It shows us what modern war truly is. Not just guns and bombs, but silence versus truth, memory versus forgetting. Telling the story of Palmyra today isn't only about the past. It's about asking hard questions of the present. What happens to a society when it loses the people who dare to speak the truth? When its leaders and creators vanish? Have you ever lost someone you deeply admired, someone who gave you hope, and suddenly they were gone? That feeling of emptiness, now multiply it 1,000 times. That's what Poland lived through in the 1940s. Palmyra isn't as famous as Normandy, it wasn't as fierce as Stalingrad. It doesn't carry the same global recognition as Auschwitz, but its lesson is no less urgent. Sometimes, to cripple a nation, you don't need an army. A few hundred bullets, aimed at the right people, can bring an entire country to its knees. That was the cold, calculated cruelty of the Nazis, and that is why Palmyra deserves to be remembered whenever we speak of World War II. It's not just a story of death. It's a reminder of how fragile freedom is, how vulnerable intelligence and creativity are, and how every generation bears the responsibility of keeping memory alive. Because, as I often tell my students, history isn't about the dead. History is a mirror for the living. So, as we begin this journey into the story of Palmyra, I want you to hold on to one question. What happens to a nation when its brightest minds are silenced in the forest and the gunshots are buried beneath silence? When we talk about World War II, most of us picture the roar of guns, tanks crushing through city streets, and planes dropping bombs from the sky. But there was another kind of front line, one far less talked about. It was the front line of memory, of intellect, of control. And in Poland, in 1939, that front erupted with deadly force. When German troops marched into Warsaw that September, they didn't just occupy a city. They seized the very heart of a nation. Warsaw at the time was like a smaller version of New York, vibrant, intellectual, full of life. It was home to the parliament, the biggest universities, newspapers, theaters, and, perhaps most importantly, the strongest patriotic spirit. The Germans knew, if they wanted to crush Poland, they had to stop this heart from beating. And here's the thing. In the eyes of the Nazis, Warsaw wasn't just a capital, it was a symbol. A city that, even after being bombed into rubble, still stood tall, singing the national anthem. Where underground newspapers were secretly printed in basements, professors kept teaching in hidden classrooms, and young people quietly prepared for the day of resistance. That is why Hitler and his machine decided if Poles couldn't be silenced on the battlefield, they would be silenced by cutting off their intellectual and spiritual leaders.
That's how the AB action was born.
The name sounds dry, like some bureaucratic order, but in reality, it was a systematic plan to eliminate anyone who could lead Poland's spirit. Journalists, professors, priests, politicians, even athletes were marked for death. Think about that for a second. Imagine waking up in America and hearing that every member of Congress, every newspaper editor, top professors, famous filmmakers, even Olympic athletes, all of them, had been arrested overnight. How would you feel? What would happen to society? One Polish prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "They did not shoot us for what we did. They shot us for what we represented." That line has stayed with me because it reveals the essence of AB action. This wasn't a war against armed resistance. It was a war against memory, against knowledge, against the very seeds of hope that kept a nation alive. To carry out this plan, the Germans needed a place hidden from the world's eyes, but close enough to Warsaw to transport prisoners under cover of night. They chose Palmyra, a dense green forest just a few miles outside the capital. By day, Palmyra was peaceful, full of birdsong and the rustling of leaves. But by night, it became a vast execution ground. Truck after truck rolled out of Pawiak prison in Warsaw, driving silently into the darkness. Few of those taken ever returned. I want you to picture this. You're imprisoned in Warsaw. One night, German guards come for you. They call your name. They tell you you're being transferred. You're shoved onto a truck, the doors slam shut, and as the engine rumbles, the familiar city slowly disappears behind you. Hours later, the truck stops. You're in the forest. No one speaks. Only the wind stirs through the trees. You're led out and see pits already dug in the ground. And then, that was how Palmyra entered history, not through a great battle, but through silent executions. What chills me most, as a historian, is how methodical it all was. This wasn't random violence. It was a deliberate plan, organized from the top down. Victims' names were carefully listed, transports scheduled, graves dug in advance. Even camouflage, planting trees and shrubs to hide the bodies, was part of the plan. All of it designed for one purpose: silence. Wars are usually remembered for the noise, the battles, the gunfire, the explosions. But I want you to understand, in World War II, there were also wars of silence, wars fought not with tanks, but with lists of names. And Palmyra stands as one of the most painful reminders of that. So the question becomes, when the heart of Poland, Warsaw, was drained of its lifeblood, what happened next? Could silence really crush resistance? Or did the gunshots in the forest of Palmyra ignite a different kind of fire, one that burned even brighter? Have you ever had a moment when everything around you looks normal, but deep down, a nameless anxiety rises up? The prisoners in Pawiak felt that same uneasy hush. They were called by name, put onto trucks, and the guards told them they were being transferred to another camp. Some actually believed it, some even hoped. Because they were allowed to take luggage, sometimes their papers were returned. Sounds almost humane, doesn't it? But it was a brutal, calculated lie. The truck rolled out of Warsaw. At first, the streets were familiar. Then, the city faded behind them, and the dense forest closed in. The engine's drone mixed with the whisper of wind through the pines. When the vehicle finally stopped, the truth was there waiting. Pits dug in the earth, ready. Picture this. You step off the truck, clutching a small bag of personal things. The clearing is eerie in its stillness. Then you see the graves, long, deep trenches stretching away. German soldiers stand waiting, rifles in hand, faces as cold as steel. No explanations. You grasp what fate has been assigned to you. Survivors later record different endings. Some tried to remain calm until the last second, praying quietly. Others stared unblinking at their executioners. Some collapsed, sobbing, begging for mercy. All of those reactions, stoicism, prayer, terror, led to the same horrifying sound: gunfire cracking in the Palmyra woods. Many were shot in the back, collapsing at the grave's edge. But there were those who were wounded and not immediately dead, later buried while still gasping. Post-war investigators exhumed bodies with hands tied and blindfolds still in place. A cold, undeniable record of cruelty. Can you imagine being buried while you're still alive? That is among the most unbearable of human cruelties. Palmyra was not a place of anonymous deaths alone. It was where Poland's brightest faces were snuffed out. There was Maciej Rataj, former Speaker of the Sejm, a moderate statesman devoted to democracy. There was Mieczysław Niedziałkowski, a socialist activist and a loud voice for justice. And there was Janusz Kusociński, Poland's 1932 Olympic champion, a national hero who once carried his country's pride into an international stadium. The man who brought home a gold medal was felled in a dark forest. No fanfare, no ceremony. I read a Warsaw resident's diary entry once. When we heard Kusoczynski had been executed, we realized no one in this country was safe anymore. If a sports hero can be taken, then every Pole is a target. That brutal truth of Palmieri is this: the killers did not care about rank or station, politician or priest, artist or athlete. If you had influence, you were on the list. One detail haunts me. In the hours before execution, some prisoners hid tiny scraps of paper in sleeves or shoes, or scrawled quick notes on handkerchiefs. When graves were later opened, those notes were found. Lines like, "We were taken to Palmieri. If anyone finds this, remember us." In the last moments, people were not only clinging to life, they were clinging to memory. They wanted their existence to be known, not swallowed by silence.
That's what makes Palmieri such a
Bloody, yet deeply human climax. Behind each victim was a story, a family, a dream. When you say the names Ratar, Nidziałkowski, Kusoczynski, you're not just reading a roster, you're hearing the severing of a culture, the forced quieting of a people. As a historian, studying Palmieri taught me something stark. This was not the random madness of war, as some excuse it to be. It was systematic, written into plans, signed off, executed step by step. Lists were drawn up, transports scheduled, graves prepared in advance. Even the effort to camouflage the burials, planting saplings, scattering needles, was part of the design. All of it had one goal: silence. Perhaps that is why Palmieri still chills us. It is not merely the story of a forest or a few graves. It is the story of a nation forced to watch its best and brightest be erased in mere gunshots. So what do you make of this? If one day your country lost all the people who could speak truth to power, who could lead and inspire, what would you do? Would you stay silent, or would you find ways to keep their memory alive? There's one thing the Nazis never truly understood. You can bury people, but you can't bury memory. Palmieri is proof of that.
The Germans thought they had planned it perfectly.
They dug trenches over 100 feet long, nearly 10 feet deep. After each execution, they filled the graves, scattered pine needles, planted young trees. They believed that within months, grass would grow, the forest would cover everything, and no one would ever know that hell had once lived there. But here's the truth. The locals knew. The woodcutters, the foresters, the hunters, they saw, they heard. They watched convoys of trucks leaving Warsaw under cover of night. They heard gunfire echoing through the trees. And even if they weren't allowed to speak of it, they knew what had happened. I want you to picture this. A forester named Adam Herbansky, along with his colleagues, secretly marked the mass graves. They used branches, carved symbols into tree bark, left signs only a trained eye would recognize. They knew the risk. If caught, they'd pay with their lives. But they did it anyway. Because deep down they understood. A nation only truly dies when its memory is erased.
Have you ever done something
Knowing it wouldn't change the present, but still chose to act for the sake of the future? That's what the Poles did. They couldn't stop the trucks. They couldn't rescue those taken into the woods. But they could preserve the evidence. They could leave a trace that said, Palmieri happened. Even within the Nazi system, cracks appeared. Some photographs of the executions, taken as official records, were stolen and smuggled out. When those images reached the Resistance and then London, Palmieri was no longer just rumor. It had proof. Proof in blood, in faces, in undeniable images. And remember, Warsaw at that time was suffocating under fear. A whispered word could mean death, yet people still risked passing notes, brief reports. Palmyra, this date, this many trucks, this many people. It was a form of combat without weapons, but no less dangerous than battle itself. I once heard a Polish resistance fighter recall, "Every time we saw the trucks drive toward the forest, it tore something inside us. We knew no one would return. But if we didn't remember, if we didn't record it, their deaths would dissolve into silence, and that would be the greatest tragedy of all." What do you think of that? War isn't only trenches and bombs. War is also fought by soldiers of memory, ordinary people who refuse to let the truth vanish. And sometimes they are the ones who keep history alive. Palmyra, on the surface, looked like a place where the strong imposed silence through violence. But beneath every mound of dirt, every marked pine, was a quiet resistance. A battle without weapons, but stronger than any army. The battle to preserve the truth. When World War II ended, Europe awoke as if from a long nightmare. But as you know, the end of war doesn't mean the end of suffering. For Poland, there was still one painful mission left: uncovering the truth and restoring names to those who had been turned into the faceless dead. As soon as the Nazis withdrew, the people of Warsaw, along with the foresters who had secretly marked the graves, returned to Palmyra. They brought in excavation teams. And what emerged from the soil were massive pits filled with bodies stacked one upon another. Many still wore their clothes, carried papers, even small personal belongings. These were not just remains. They were proof that confirmed every note, every whispered record the villagers had risked their lives to keep. Imagine that moment. A wife clutching her husband's broken glasses, a child recognizing their father's silver medallion. What kind of weight must that grief have carried? Years of wartime anguish erupting into a reality that could no longer be denied. Palmyra was no longer a secret in the forest. It stepped into the light, with more than 1,700 victims identified. Among them were lawmakers, journalists, professors, and artists, the very heart of Polish society. That's why Palmyra is often called the Polish Katyn, a deliberate slaughter of the nation's intellectual elite, meant to cripple an entire people. And you know what? In the post-war trials, especially at Nuremberg, Palmyra was used as evidence of crimes against humanity. Several SS and Gestapo officers were sentenced to death. Justice could never erase the loss, but at least it sent one message: the truth would not be buried with the victims. A former prosecutor once said, "When we exhumed those graves, we weren't just unearthing bones, we were unearthing the truth, and that truth was heavier than any bullet ever fired in the war." Today, Palmyra is a national cemetery and museum. Visitors don't just see rows of white crosses in a pine forest, they feel something deeper. This was once a battlefield, not of guns and tanks, but of truth against oblivion. Have you ever stood in a war cemetery? The silence isn't empty. It speaks. Every headstone, every patch of earth, carries a story that was never fully told. Palmyra closed the war with numbers, trials, and memorials. But above all, it left us with a lesson. Evil can kill people, but it can never kill memory. And memory is the very foundation on which justice survives. You know, history is never just cold numbers or lines in a textbook. History is living memory. Whispers from the past, reminding us which path we must choose today. Palmyra is one of those reminders. There, more than 1,700 intellectuals and ordinary citizens were executed. The Nazi goal wasn't only to kill people, it was to kill the very soul of a nation, to erase collective memory, to turn Poland into an empty shell that could be easily ruled. But Palmieri proves the opposite. Collective memory can be wounded, but it can never be destroyed.
Isn't it striking
That in the 20th century, a century of science, art, and progress, humanity still allowed massacres like Palmieri, Katyn, and the Holocaust to happen? That question isn't just for the past, it's for us today. Are we truly vigilant against the signs of hatred and dehumanization when they begin to appear? A US veteran once told me, speaking about crimes like Palmieri, "We don't study history to assign blame. We study it to recognize the fragile line between civilization and barbarism, and to make sure that line is never crossed again." Now picture this, a high school classroom in America. Students are hearing about Palmieri for the very first time. They've never lived through war, or hunger, or torture, or executions. But if Palmieri's story makes them sit in silence for a few seconds and then ask, "Why did this happen? How do we stop it from happening again?" then Palmieri's memory is still alive.
And maybe that's the greatest meaning of all.
Palmieri is not only a cemetery, not only a tragic full stop, it's a mirror for humanity. It asks us, what will you do when the truth is buried? Will you stay silent, or will you be the one who carves a mark into the tree bark so that history will never be forgotten? When you leave this video, I want you to carry one thing with you. History is not distant. It lives in our memory and in the choices we make every day. Palmieri reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, there were people who chose to keep the flame of memory alive. And that flame, if we pass it on, will never die.